Linda van Tilburg for Biznews. A legal challenge is looming between the DA and the IEC and DIRCO over the challenges South Africans abroad are facing to vote at embassies, high commissions and consulates. It follows after voters in Perth discovered that they can only vote at the South African High Commission in Canberra. And to tell us more about that, we have MP Adrian Roos from the DA with us. Hi Adrian, welcome to Biznews.
Hi Linda.
Well, can you just give us a bit of background about voting abroad and the problems?
Yeah, look, so I'm the Deputy Shadow Minister of Home Affairs. So my mailbox is filled every day with persons reaching out, mainly from overseas, to try and get services from Home Affairs, etc. And it's no different with voters now overseas, trying to access the online system, trying to get it to work, trying to see how they can just exercise their constitutional right. And I think, there's a big challenge we have, and the situation that I always talk about is that as a South African citizen, you've got more of a chance of voting if you're a prisoner than you do if you live overseas. And really, Australia is the case in point. You have over 200,000 South African residents there, and only 500 of them voted. Just around 500 voted in the 2019 elections. So clearly something is wrong. We had a situation at the beginning with this online registration process where South Africans could enter their address, and suddenly that was taken away for some reason or another. And so what the Democratic Alliance is looking at is saying, listen, we need to allow South Africans overseas their constitutional right to be able to vote as much as is reasonably possible.
Yeah, but they made it a little bit easy, the fact that we can register online. But, if you talk about Australia specifically, Canberra is very far from Sydney and from Perth, the case in point here. And you've asked for changes to the Electoral Act, but it seems that this has not been granted.
Well, look, I think the starting point and what the Democratic Alliance is looking at now is just to utilize, is that the existing legislation is carried out. So the persons are allowed to vote at a consulate. It is allowed in the legislation. But we have many, many honorary consuls around the world where South Africans are not allowed to vote. And so we need to understand why that is. Now, we asked the IEC and they say, no, it's a DIRCO issue. We asked DIRCO, they say it's an IEC issue. And this is the challenge at the moment because you have what's called honorary consuls, but it's a consulate. And in the law, you're supposed to be able to go and be able to vote at a consulate. So, for example, if, we were speaking about Australia, there's honorary consuls in Melbourne, in Brisbane, and Adelaide, for example. So there's no reason why South Africans shouldn't be able to register and vote there.
But there was this excuse of the staff at these consulates that they are consuls that they don't come from South Africa or something like that.
Well, I think, sometimes when these things are brought up, the issue of cost becomes a thing to say, it's impractical and costs, et cetera, et cetera. A few years ago, the tax laws changed that South Africans overseas now get taxed over a certain amount. And the question is, well, if you can't say there's no money to do these things. You can't say there's not enough staff at the consulate, for example, to second them. You're now asking essentially 195,500 South Africans to fly to Canberra to vote instead of asking a few people to go to these honorary consulates and staff.
Is this the problem only in Australia or elsewhere, like America?
Well, it's actually worsened. I mean, I think if you look at really where South Africans are, New Zealand is another good case because, if you're in Auckland, for example, it's a very, very long trip from Wellington. Where you currently can vote. I think it's over 500 miles or 500 kilometers. And so it's not so easy to take 1,000-kilometer round trip, if it is kilometers, to go and vote. And it's a similar scenario there. So, my understanding is there's an honorary consulate in Auckland, for example. So, you really should be able to vote there. You look at persons in Malta, for example, where there's an honorary consulate. They have to go and vote in Rome. And so it's really unreasonable. There's a number of areas where you have these honorary consuls and it's in the legislation, so they must just do it.
Well, it's quite close to the election. Some people are expecting 22nd of May. Mr. Ramaphosa expected to announce it within the next 2 weeks. Is there time to actually fix this?
Well, I think at the moment, even as you look at the local registration scenarios, there are cases where literally on a weekend, there might be some issues around the voting station, and then it gets moved. So we're not talking about big numbers. And even early on, when the Democratic Alliance looked at the numbers of persons that are being disenfranchised, there was a recommendation of literally 6 to 10 additional voting stations around the world, which would capture a significant number of the unserved population. So even if obviously you need to look at honorary consuls and say within the law, this is a requirement. But even if you just take the 6 to 10, it's not asking a lot to be able to staff those.
So you've given the government and of DIRCO and the IEC a couple of deadlines, but they have now passed. So what next?
Yeah, look, so from our understanding, it's a similar blame-shifting game. I say we're really just looking at the office now to assess the next steps. Unfortunately, I don't have an exact answer for you on when and what, but it will be communicated in due course because we are running out of time.
Would you consider going to the Electoral Court?
Well, that is the ultimatum that we put, that the law be implemented. It's all that we're asking, that these consuls, these honorary consuls, they should be opened up. So, even if you look at the prisoner scenario that I gave in the beginning, that came to pass because of a court approach in the August matter in 1999. And so, I think it's something where we would like to believe that the IEC as a Chapter 9 institution, we hear about the prisoners. They have a target of 100,000 to vote out of a prison population of about 127,000. You don't hear similar targets for voters overseas, which is extremely unfortunate. I think, again, we hear about human rights, and this right to vote it's a human right, and it's one of our most precious rights that we have as South Africans. So you expect to hear a similar level of determination about voters overseas, and we accept the online registration is a big step forward in that regard. But I think if you're serious about enfranchising voters overseas, when they register, you need to capture their physical address to understand where your voters are and the extent of the problem so that you can resolve that. Because at the end of the day, you might find that with only 6 to 10 honorary consuls that you then make available, you turn around and say, we've made a reasonable attempt to cover the vast majority. Persons don't want to be silly about the whole thing, but we want to make sure that you have as reasonable a chance as possible and as practical to vote.
So, as I said, it's not a lot of time left. If you take it to the Electoral Court, how quickly could a decision be made?
I'm not really sure about that, how long it might take, but it might be considered to be an urgent matter. Because indeed it is. Once the Cyril Ramaphosa announces a date, and you've literally got days left for that, then once it's promulgated, the voting registration closes. So it would surely be considered an urgent matter and dealt with speedily.
You've mentioned some of the figures of how many voters you think there are in Australia. What are we looking at the total figure of expats or South Africans abroad? What is the total figure? What is the DA hoping to get from that? How many votes and how many seats could you potentially get?
Well, look, I think the DA has obviously done a lot of research in this regard, looking at the population overseas and absolutely verified probably as little as 900,000, but the generally accepted figure is around 2 million South Africans abroad. And then certainly you're looking at in the range of 200 to 300,000 out of that lot to be able to register and vote. And, even if you just take a very round figure of 50,000, then you would have, potentially 4 to 6 seats in Parliament. And I must say, if you look at the last few years, and especially what the Democratic Alliance has been fighting for persons overseas in terms of consular services, taking the petition to Parliament, that was a petition with over 10,000 signatures of affected South Africans overseas. There was the loss of citizenship case, also affecting many thousands of South Africans. And so we've definitely been driving issues affecting South Africans through Parliament.
Do you have any figures of how many South Africans abroad have registered so far for the election?
My understanding is it's around 30,000 at this point. But again, we have a lot of issues, and one of the stumbling blocks is that somebody would go on and see that there's nothing nearby where they stay and then be discouraged and then not complete the registration, let's say for Canberra. If they live in Perth and they realize they're not going to be able to vote, then they abort that. So that is anecdotally the stories that we're getting and the complaints to say this is too far away. How do we do this?
You've also spoken before about the problem with getting passports and renewed in overseas mission. I mean, it took me, despite a fast track process in London, it took me almost a year to get my passport back because I don't know what the delays were. They both blaming each other, but I can finally now fetch it. Is that also a problem for other South Africans abroad?
Yeah, like I say, I mean, the petition that took to Parliament, there were well over 10,000 signatures, which is quite high for a petition to Parliament. And it's something that I get daily questions on. Specifically, let's say persons have children and then they want to travel with the children. At this point in time, we managed to get a concession from the Department of Home Affairs to allow persons to apply through visa facilitation services in the UK and trial that out to see if it was easier to apply through that. But even there are certainly some problems. But the promise was to roll that out across other countries with large South African populations. So that is the commitment to the minister on that. One of the other big issue was the diplomatic bag. So the DA is saying in South Africa, you go online, you take your photo, you fill in your application online for your passport or ID renewal, and then you submit it with the payment, and then you merely go and do your biometrics somewhere. And the Department of Home Affairs couldn't give me a sound reason why you couldn't do that same process from overseas, from the comfort of your home. Do that. For example, when I think it was my brother that wanted to go to Australia, and he did that, filled in everything online and went to TCS and gave his biometrics, and that was it. So there's no real reason because there isn't a valid reason.
Well, especially if they're using another company to do it. That should be even faster. It's not the embassies actually doing it.
Sure. So now at the moment, trying to get an appointment in an embassy at Wellington, it's months. You literally wait 5 to 8 months just to get there and start your application. So you have a scenario where you're supposed to apply for your passport renewal. You're supposed to give it just over a year. But if it takes you 8 months to apply, there's no ways you're going to get it. Because the turnaround time period is 8 to 24 months as it is. If you're an Indian citizen, for example, in the UAE, you'll be able to get your passport done within a week.
So how can South Africans abroad stay informed about changes? Because if changes do come.
Yeah, so obviously the Democratic Alliance has the DA abroad, which is really fighting for South Africans. We have chapters in different parts of the world, but on the DA abroad website is a lot of information about all the matters that we're taking up in Parliament on behalf of South Africans abroad, as well as extensive information about the registration process and what is happening with the court case. So obviously, as soon as we take the next step, then we communicate that through that channel. So keep an eye on that channel.
Could you elaborate on your point about how South Africans abroad pay tax over a certain income and how that places a responsibility on the government to provide services for them, like voting stations?
Yeah, look, I think one has to be careful to say that someone that doesn't have money then shouldn't get a service, etc. But if there is tax payable over a certain income overseas, there's a reason to start that. One could also argue that if you give none of that back, you could consider that to be some form of embezzlement. I mean, if you're not collecting money, because at the end of the day, it's the whole idea of tax is a social compact where persons give you tax money in order to provide broader services that protects everybody. So tax is not money that gets taken to give to your friends and family, and it is supposed to do that. And if South Africans are being expected to pay tax overseas, and then when they apply for passports, etc., they pay a fee, then what is the purpose of that tax? a lot of that tax money, you could argue that it goes to the honorary consul, for example. You should really expect that every 2 to 3 years when there's an election, well, let's say it's a national election, every 5 years, that honorary consul can arrange a voting station for people to come and vote. Otherwise, what is the purpose of taxing persons that are living overseas, that are not using South African infrastructure of a general nature, and that are then paying for everything that they are using?
Can we just quickly, as a last question, get to some of the polls recently out? Well, a lot of them are now saying the ANC would drop below 50%. The other interesting, I think it was Ipsos poll that said that the DA they saw as static on the same, I think it was 22%. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, the Ipsos polls are not the most reliable polls. There are a lot of cases of that, and so it's it's not the most reliable polling data, unfortunately. So the Democratic Alliance, I think the important thing is with the multi-party charter and the parties that are getting together. We are closer than ever before now to the ANC, to bringing them below 50%. And it's absolutely critical for every South African that cares about rescuing South Africa. We cannot have another 5 years of this that has been going on. The country is literally running out of money now, running out of money to pay grants. For example, the grant increases have been way below inflation for the last 5 years. So they will say we've given a 2% increase in some categories. Other categories are reduced, or there's no increase, and therefore they are actually going down all the time because there's no money left. So it's critical that every South African that cares about rescuing South Africa can register to vote and make that vote. We're closer to than ever. It is possible, and every credible poll is saying that the ANC will go well below 50%, and we will have the opportunity to have that change.
Adrian Roos, Member of Parliament for the DA, thanks so much.
Great, thank you.